Hi, I'm Mike DeBonis, and you are listening to the Audio Description Narrators of America Know Your Narrator series, Beyond Your Narrator episode.
Today we have a bonus episode with Will Schell. He is the attorney advisor for the Disability Rights Office at the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Let's jump right in. What do you love about audio description?
Well, I personally love audio description. I am a blind attorney at the Disability Rights Office at the FCC, and I enjoy audio description in my personal life, but then also I enjoy audio description for what it can mean for blind people across the country. I'll just keep saying that it can mean a lot to people in the sense that it can give people information that they didn't otherwise have, that there's a massive cultural and societal kind of life on television, right? This is what we talk about around the water cooler. This is a huge, important part of our lives. And audio description can bring, in some cases, just raw information that you wouldn't otherwise get, but in other cases, add a ton of value, including entertainment value, on top of what was the experience before that. So that's what I love about audio description, the promise of it, I guess.
And it sounds like you're distinguishing beyond the entertainment value. Like you said, it's not just a movie. There's a real sense of connection that can happen because of access to audio description.
Absolutely. I think we've all found or heard that one audio describer that changed the movie, maybe the movie that you've seen 100 times before, but has changed it in such a way, and it's so hard to pin down what makes that good, right? And I'm not a professional audio describer or professional anything. I'm an attorney, so I'm interested in the rules and the bits, but in my own personal experience, I've seen an audio describer that I thoroughly enjoyed in one show that the describer almost disappeared. They weren't part of the show even one bit. And other times, another audio describer that was much more present, and that was exactly what was called for in that show. So it's the fine art that I don't fully understand.
And the way you've just described that, whether it's that presence or that disappear, both seem to suggest that your experience as a consumer, you had an immersive experience when it's been good.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, well, that kind of the difficulty of pinning this stuff down, right? What makes for good audio description is that you often only know what good audio description is when you experience it. And because each show is so different, and because each movie is so different, a different type of description can really change the way that you experience the show. But that leads right into one of the most interesting things that I want to kind of mention is audio description quality standards, right? So for other types of accessibility services or accessibility rules, traditionally you would start to get towards quality standards. And we don't have any at the FCC. There's no quality standards at all. And so that means that you can have really bad audio description or really great audio description, and we don't have any way to kind of distinguish between the two from a legal basis. So it's just an interesting situation, and we've been trying a little over the years to kind of look at audio description quality, and it just eludes us to be able to try to pin down particularities, at least so far.
Can you speak to your professional efforts in the FCC as far as audio description goes?
As I was saying, there's no audio description quality standards, but there are a bunch of other standards or rules around audio description, and it's primarily focused around, providing X amount of hours for X type of programming. A lot of audio description under our rules, it's focused on the major players for older types of programming technology. So it's focused on over-the-air broadcasting and the top 4 broadcasters and the top 5 non-broadcast channels, the top 5 cable channels. And those are the only networks that are required under our rules to provide audio description. There's a lot more audio description out there. There's plenty of networks that provide audio description on cable or even over the air that aren't required to under our rules. And then there's also a bunch of online new video programming technologies that are implementing audio description. And I think that's really the most interesting thing. So the new technologies, Amazon, Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu, whoever's doing the next streaming service, they are suddenly starting to realize, especially as some of the initial streaming services really got off to the races with providing audio description, the other ones are realizing that this is really critical. People are using it a lot, and that is starting to push the other services, cable, satellite, and fiber TV services, and over-the-air services to kind of up their game a little bit. That's my impression anyway. I don't have any real real data for that, but that's my impression, that as Netflix and Amazon add all of their content to have audio description, the new streaming services feel like that's an entry-level proposition. And then those same new streaming services also own other traditional services like cable and satellite and over-the-air broadcasting. So I think it just starts to bleed into all of that stuff. But our rules are starting, the audio description rules, I feel like are starting to a little outdated in some ways, right? They're still focused on prime time programming and children's programming. Like, seriously, what's prime time in a world when everything's as you want to watch it, right? Mm-hmm. But there's still traditional television. It's still happening. So I guess our rules are still, relevant.
First of all, your interview on Picture This podcast was so fascinating, and you really got into those details of how those rules have impacted the over-the-air broadcast. And with you speaking of the value of upping the game for these streaming services to opt in, I can't help but think that your success in these mandated hours has led to awareness on the streaming side. Is that a fair assumption that kind of snowball could have been started because of the efforts?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I think it's fair in one sense. I think it's totally fair to make that argument, but I think it's also fair, and this might sound funny coming from someone who works in regulations, but I think it's also fair to say that one way that companies oftentimes stay out of being regulated is by doing it all. Right? So like, if you're providing a streaming service and it starts to become, the public starts to become dependent upon it, right? It becomes a used item. At some point, I'm trying to be very vague with my analogies, but I should just yell, Netflix, basically. Like, but when you start to get to full saturation level where all Americans have access to your program, you then start to become critical. And if you start making mistakes or things like that, like in a very broad sense, that's when kind of Congress gets their attention on certain things or whatever. And, if you're providing closed captions and you're providing audio description for every single one of your programs, there's no regulatory issue. Like, there's nothing to regulate in a way. So I feel like, that may be happening as well, where there may be nothing. They may have taken the cues from our rules and the broadcasters providing this service, but they also might have taken it as this is also a way to prevent coming under the regulatory wing, because if our customers never have anything to complain about, if they have a better service here than they do anywhere else, then we'll never become a regulated entity. But that's one argument as well, I guess.
Yeah. Can you think of a specific example in your efforts on the regulatory side or the rules side that you're maybe a challenge that you faced that you're really proud of how you or your team overcame?
There's a bunch of really nerdy nuances in some of our rules around accessible interfaces for these devices that play video programming. So what's the point of having audio description, right, if the device that you're using isn't accessible for you to be able to turn it on and off? That's actually quite common. And so I think our strongest rules in this area aren't in the audio description world. They're actually in the devices have to be accessible for people to actually use them in order to watch video description. And I always, sometimes I go to conventions or whatever, and I always talk about our rules. If you read our rules, it essentially says that any device that can play video programming over the internet, then that device has to have the accessible controls built into it, including the ability to turn on and off audio description. And so that would include things like, I always mention smart refrigerators, right? Like if your smart refrigerator can play video programming, like people apparently do. I don't have a smart refrigerator, but if it can play a recipe video, then quite possibly it would have to have the accessibility controls. Our rules would then just say like that refrigerator must have accessible controls. And those accessible controls go far beyond audio description. That goes into play, stop, pause, fast forward, menus, settings, all the various things, including the ability for people who are blind or visually impaired to be able to turn on and off closed captioning. It's another one too, which I love. I love that idea that you can be blind and still want the desire to have an accessible way to turn on closed captioning, and we put it in the rules. But I guess as an example, to answer your question finally, as an example of something that I'm really proud of is, we had a number of complaints about the ability to turn on and off audio description for set-top boxes for cable providers. And the set-top boxes for cable providers didn't have a requirement at the time for a quick and easy way for you to turn on and off audio description. And what became clear later is that the set-top boxes were separated from all other devices. The set-top boxes for cable, satellite, and fiber companies didn't have to have a quick and easy way to turn on and off audio description. They did have to have an accessible way to do it, and that would include going through the endless settings menu in order to change the setting from English to Spanish usually, right? You usually change the language setting to Spanish so that you can get to the secondary audio track. Long story short is that there was an emergency provision, an emergency rule, emergency information rule that we had that said, if you're going to have emergency information on your television, then you're going to have to be able to hear it in an accessible manner and quickly. So there was actually a rule that said for emergency situations, people who are blind have to be able to quickly turn on and off the audio description. And so that rule applies to the set-top boxes. And I guess the reason why I'm very proud of it is very legal, very kind of lawyerly way to look at a different rule and figure out that actually it serves the same purpose for a deficit where set-top boxes didn't have a way of quickly turning on and off audio description. So that's something I'm really proud of, especially if you've ever experienced that traveling through the 600, 700 TV stations and constantly hitting the secondary audio, and it's Spanish, audio description, nothing, blank sound, a repeat of the first audio track, and then Spanish again. And every time you'll want to either switch or switch back to check. So having a quick and easy way to switch while watching cable, I think is really, really important. And I think we've made a big improvement there.
Wow. And it sounds like that's the accessibility of accessibility. We've used that meta term before, and it's like, it's if it's accessible, it needs to be accessible to be accessible. And one of the things that's fascinating about your approach through the emergency info is that now that technology exists for emergency, it sounds like, well, now it's there, might as well apply it to other aspects. Is that a fair result?
Absolutely. I mean, what we've seen, I'll give you a great example of that, is emergency information. Again, there is a requirement that if cable companies allow their customers to watch cable services on a tablet or a second screen device. So in their own home, on their own network, then we require that they pass through the emergency information to the tablet. So if you're sitting on your couch watching cable on your tablet and an emergency happens, an emergency alert, emergency information is broadcast, then it needs to get to the tablet. It can't just be on the TV. So that was a rule that we had. And also that emergency information has to be accessible. And so that means both auditorily and visually accessible. I think the cable companies have taken the approach that they don't want to interrupt all viewing experiences unless it's a major emergency. So they have to make it accessible either by using the secondary audio or by cutting off everyone's audio and playing it on the main audio. And they traditionally put it on the secondary audio, and that means that the emergency information, again, has to be accessible on the secondary tablet, and you have to be able to switch back and forth. That's one example of where when one thing exists, the other thing kind of has to exist. We have an open question right now. It's a question in our rules that says, and this was quite a while ago when this happened, so I'm not sure of the exact history, but it asks the public, should we also require a way to turn on and off the secondary audio? Now, I think that they were talking about audio description and not emergency information. I don't think they would ever issue a rule that says the emergency information has to be passed through to a secondary audio, to a second screen device, but you don't have to be able to activate it. I think that they were asking it in a different way, but that still exists where there may not be a way to turn on and off the emergency information, but eventually we'll get there. It's an open question, so eventually the FCC will process the information and pass a rule.
Talk about nerdy nuances.
I'm keeping it light. We can go real deep.
If you were to think about where you're excited for audio description to go, whether as a consumer or within the world of FCC's rules, can you talk about either of those aspects, where you'd love to have audio description headed?
Yeah, and I can talk about it because it's not on the horizon. It's not something that we're working on. So this is just my own personal kind of thoughts about it. But I really feel like the next frontier for audio description is separating it from the track itself. I mean, fairly recently, we started to hear a lot of the community get a little up in arms over a 5.1 surround sound or Atmos is not, you turn on audio description and it ruins your beautiful speaker system you have set up. And on top of that, there are, I don't know who these people are, but I hear reports that there are spouses or others in the room who don't want the audio description on. And so separating it, I think, I really hope will become kind of standard issue device audio technology in the future. That, and then of course, the future of kind of more accessible products and services is kind of being able to have the same information about the descriptions, either in auditory form or in text form, and being able for deafblind consumers to be able to utilize the information, the accessible information that's being sent, either in Braille or in large print or auditorily or however they want to kind of access it. So that's where I think that would be kind of a hopeful future, to kind of break some of these pieces apart and allow people to use them in the way that they would most prefer to use them. If that makes sense.
Sure does. And what an exciting future to know that it's a possibility and something to aim for both of those aspects, separating and for different ways of accessing.
Yeah, I mean, there's companies who are working on it right now and are kind of making it a priority to figure out how to give television access to the deafblind community. And whether the deafblind community wants to watch the same things that we're all watching, I think will be hard to know until we kind of get there. But definitely, I'm sure you've experienced it where you went to a friend's house or like a in-laws house or something like that, and you've attempted to interact with their television setup, and you can't do it. Like, those people have plugged in, they've got their setup in a way, they've got 50 remotes and they've got 100 boxes plugged in, and you don't know which order to press things. That level of complexity is the same level of complexity that I think the community wants. Like, if I want the audio description to go into my hearing aids, but then I want the captions to be on Braille display, like, why shouldn't that be possible? These are all compartmented streams that somehow they get crammed together when they get put up on the screen. But we should be able to cram them if we want.
Anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I guess I should mention that, audio description very broadly doesn't get a lot of complaints, primarily because, again, we don't have quality standards. So if someone calls up our office and says, I didn't like this audio describer, I didn't like the way that they were too invasive, or the noise on the TV was too loud, or the describer was too loud, or whatever, the things that I'm sure you care about deeply, there's no rules for that from us. So if we get those types of complaints, there's nothing that we can do with them. But we would still be interested in hearing about people's complaints about usability of the devices and how they can or can't turn on audio description. We'd be really interested in hearing about what people think about quality and whether or not they think one particular service is better than another, or if their device or service is not providing audio description. It's a complicated world, and sometimes it takes us a little time to help resolve it, but you can file complaints with our office. You can file complaints with us by emailing us at dro@fcc.gov. You can also just email me directly if you'd like at will.schell@fcc.gov. That's will.schell@fcc.gov. All of our information is available about these rules and everything at fcc.gov/accessibility.
Very cool. And it's wonderful to hear about how our audio description audiences can have that source to give feedback for these usability issues.
Yeah, we do get some complaints, but it's just not very many, even though I hear them in the community, but we never get them filed. And I think it's just because there's no file to file in a way. But we do hear about, like, the sirens on the TV were so loud that I couldn't actually hear the describer describing what was happening at the scene of the crime or whatever, And that type of stuff, we would take that information, and most often we would send it not as a complaint, but as a notification to the broadcaster or to the video program provider, and just let them know, hey, one of your customers is unhappy with one of your products, and here's the information. And we'd make it clear to them this isn't a violation of our rules, but we wanted to pass this information on to you. So, but also people should know that the networks don't mind it if you call them and tell them your thoughts. Like, different networks, I'm sure, would be more responsive than others, but ultimately they need to hear whether or not things are working. And if that information makes it all the way back up, then the word will get around. There should be a little change or something like that.
What other elements of community involvement can you address?
The one thing that I am constantly surprised at when I go to either blind conventions or I meet just blind people out in the community is how many people don't know that audio description even exists or that they have access to it. So many blind people, of course, know that it exists, but they don't know that their current TV can turn it on, or that the set-top box that they have has the ability to turn it on. And the one thing that happens, I think, especially for older people, so the largest population of blind people are elderly who didn't get all of the training and information and access to the blind library services and things like that when they were younger. And so just even informing blind people that this exists, I think is also another really critical area. And then how to turn it on and off, I think, just will never stop being an issue. How do you turn this on and off? But that's one thing that always amazes me.
Very cool. Thanks so much for joining us, Will. This is great.
Yeah, very nice to be on.